In 1979, on a stretch of London pavement running from Oxford Circus to Tottenham Court Road, Richard Branson opened a record shop so large that critics called it absurd. He called it the Megastore. For 30 years, that name meant something. Teenagers queued round the block for album launches. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder in listening booths, headphones on, saying nothing, discovering the same song at the same moment. Musicians walked in through the front doors to sign records for fans who had waited all night in the rain. It was the beating heart of British music culture, stacked 5 floors high. Then, within 18 months of each other, the flagship in London and every last store in America closed their doors for good. How did the man who built an empire out of vinyl records fail to survive the very revolution in music he once seemed destined to lead? This is the story of the shop that made a generation fall in love with music, and the decisions that let it die. Richard Branson was 20 years old when he first tried to sell records by post. It was 1970 and he was running the whole operation out of a church crypt in London, filling envelopes with vinyl and hoping enough of them would arrive before customers gave up and asked for their money back. He was restless, undisciplined, and almost broke. But he had one instinct that would define the next 30 years of his life. He understood that young people didn't just want to buy music, they wanted somewhere to belong to it. In 1971, that instinct became a shop. Branson and his business partner, Nick Powell, opened a small record store above a shoe shop on Notting Hill Gate, calling it Virgin, a nod to how new they both were to business. It was nothing like a conventional record shop. There were beanbags scattered across the floor instead of browser racks pushed tight together. There was free vegetarian food for anyone who wandered in. The shelves leaned toward German import records, krautrock, motoric rhythms, music most British shops wouldn't have known how to order. Customers weren't rushed. They were invited to sit down, put on a pair of headphones, and stay a while. That was the whole philosophy in miniature. A record shop should feel like someone's front room, not a till. By the end of the decade, that small idea had grown too big for a single shopfront. In 1979, Branson opened something on an entirely different scale, a store so large it needed a new word to describe it. He called it the Megastore, and he put it on Oxford Street at the corner of Tottenham Court Road, in the middle of London's busiest shopping mile. Picture the doors opening for the first time. The space was cavernous compared to anything British music fans had shopped in before. Floor after floor of vinyl, cassettes, and imports, with listening booths built into the walls so customers could hear an album before they committed to buying it. The smell was new plastic sleeves and fresh carpet. The sound was fragments of a dozen different records bleeding into each other as shoppers moved from booth to booth. There was no hushed reverence here, the way there might be in an old-fashioned shop with a proprietor behind the counter. This was noisy, crowded, and alive. The first customers were exactly who Branson had built the shop for: students, music obsessives, teenagers with more curiosity than money, drawn from across London by a word of mouth that something different had opened on Oxford Street. For many of them, walking through those doors for the first time felt less like entering a shop and more like being let in somewhere. Branson's belief, in his own words years later, was simple. People didn't want to be sold to. They wanted to be given the space to discover something for themselves. The Megastore was built entirely around that idea, and for the better part of 2 decades, it would prove him right. But an idea built for a music-obsessed generation with time to spend browsing was about to be tested by growth on a scale nobody, not even Branson, had originally imagined. By the late 1980s, Oxford Street had a landmark that didn't need to explain itself. If you told anyone in London you were meeting at the Megastore, they knew exactly which doors you meant. The ritual was almost the same for everyone. You didn't go to Virgin Megastore with a list. You went to lose an hour, sometimes an afternoon, drifting between floors with no particular purpose beyond seeing what was there. Saturdays were the worst for crowds and the best for atmosphere. Teenagers meeting friends by the escalators, students flicking through import racks they couldn't quite afford, families letting their kids loose in the video games section while they browsed the chart albums upstairs. Nobody minded the crowds were the point. The listening booths were where the real magic happened. You'd pick up a record, ask an assistant to cue it, and stand there with the headphones on while London kept moving outside the windows. Strangers stood side by side in adjoining booths, each lost in a different album, and there was an unspoken etiquette to it. You didn't rush the person next to you, and if you caught their eye nodding along to something, you might just strike up a conversation about it afterwards. One former shopper, recalling those Saturdays years later, put it simply: you went in not knowing what you wanted, and you left having found something you didn't know existed. For employees, working the shop floor during those years carried its own particular thrill. Staff remembered artists walking in the front entrance, unannounced to the browsing public, to sign copies of a new release at a table set up between the aisles. Queues forming instantly, snaking back through the video section, sometimes out onto the pavement itself. For a shop assistant barely out of school, standing a few feet from a musician they'd been listening to on their own record player the week before, was proof they were working somewhere that actually mattered. That was the deeper appeal of the Megastore. It wasn't simply a shop that sold what was popular. It was where popular culture happened in real time, in a room you could physically walk into. The occasions people chose it for tell their own story. A birthday meant being handed money and told to go and pick something for yourself at the Megastore. A first job meant your first big purchase there. A proper stereo system, an entire back catalog of an artist you'd only been able to afford one album of before. A trip into central London with friends with no other plan almost always ended up there anyway, because everyone assumed everyone else would want to go. It wove itself into the culture well beyond its own four walls. The Oxford Street flagship became a fixture of London life referenced in music press coverage of the era, a stop on the unofficial tour of the city for visiting music fans, a backdrop so familiar it barely needed introducing on the rare occasions television cameras caught it in passing. To grow up in or near London during these years was, for many people, to have the Megastore woven into your own personal timeline of growing up. The place you went before you were old enough to be let into gig venues, and the place you kept going back to long after. What made it irreplaceable wasn't the range of stock alone, because in time other chains would try to copy the format. It was the sense that a shop this size in this location existed for you to linger in. That nobody behind the counter was going to hurry you toward the till. Ask anyone who was there, and they'll tell you it wasn't really about the records at all. It was about the version of themselves they became inside that building. A little bolder, a little more certain of their own taste, surrounded by people who felt the same pull toward music that they did. It is easy looking back from today to assume a shop this loved was safe. Nothing in the atmosphere of those Saturday afternoons on Oxford Street suggested otherwise. And yet quietly, in ways almost nobody browsing those aisles could have noticed, the first small pressures that would eventually bring the whole format down were already beginning to build. Success on Oxford Street created an obvious temptation. If one enormous store could work this well in London, why not build the same thing everywhere else in the world? The answer came quickly. Branson and his retail chief, Ian Duffel, began pushing the Megastore format outward from Britain through the second half of the 1980s and into the 1990s. Australia got its first store in 1988, opened in Sydney before further branches followed in Melbourne and Adelaide. Paris received its own Megastore that same year, marking Virgin's first major push onto the European continent. Japan followed in 1990, bringing the format into Tokyo's dense retail landscape. Then, in 1992, Virgin partnered with the American video rental giant Blockbuster to bring the concept to the United States, opening its first American store on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, a location chosen deliberately for its symbolic weight in music history. Back home, the expansion was just as aggressive, though it took a different shape. Rather than only building new flagships from scratch, Virgin set its sights on absorbing an existing rival. In 1998, the company completed its full acquisition of Our Price, the high street music chain it had previously only partly owned through a joint venture with W.H. Smith. The deal brought 229 Our Price shops under the Virgin banner, alongside the 88 megastores already trading, briefly swelling Virgin's UK retail footprint to 317 outlets in one stroke. Not through the slow, careful cultivation that had built the Oxford Street flagship, but through the sheer scale of a corporate acquisition. This was growth of a different character entirely. The original megastore had been built around an idea: give people room to linger and they will come back. Rolling out that idea across dozens of countries and hundreds of storefronts required something else: consistency, logistics, and the discipline of a chain rather than the personality of a single beloved shop. Maintaining the sense that every megastore was still somewhere special, rather than simply a larger record shop with the right signage, became harder with every new market Virgin entered. The physical footprint tells its own story of ambition. By the mid-1990s, the Virgin Megastore name could be found from Sydney to Tokyo, from Los Angeles to Central Paris, spreading across some of the most expensive retail real estate on Earth. Flagship stores were deliberately planted on the busiest, most visible streets a city had to offer: Oxford Street in London, Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, the Champs-Élysées in Paris. It was a strategy built on visibility and prestige as much as on convenience, and for a time, the sheer scale of these locations reinforced exactly the image Virgin wanted. This was the biggest name in music retail anywhere in the world. For the people working inside this rapidly growing company, expansion meant genuine opportunity. New markets needed new staff, new store managers, new regional executives who had started, in some cases, behind the counter of the original Oxford Street shop. For a young employee with ambition, the Virgin Megastore name was suddenly a passport to running operations on another continent. But growth on this scale also brought a quieter kind of pressure: head office targets, standardized stock reports, and the sense for some longtime staff that the freewheeling shop culture of the 1970s was being steadily replaced by something more corporate underneath the surface. And there was one more cost to expansion that went almost unnoticed at the time. As Virgin poured its energy and capital into new flagships abroad, the original Oxford Street store, the building that had started it all in 1979, increasingly became just one location among dozens, however cherished it remained in the public imagination. The intimacy of the founding idea was, by necessity, being diluted across an ever larger map. None of this looked like trouble in the moment. It looked like victory. By the time the 1990s were drawing to a close, Virgin Megastore was arguably the most recognized music retail brand on the planet, its name stamped across some of the world's most famous streets. The company was about to reach the absolute height of its cultural power, a peak so complete that almost nobody standing inside those stores could have imagined how quickly it would all unravel. By the end of the 1990s, Virgin Megastore had reached a scale that no music retailer before it had ever managed. The Oxford Street flagship alone stretched across roughly 30,000 square feet over 6 floors, and the UK network built around it had swollen to over 300 outlets following the R-Price acquisition. Beyond Britain, the Megastore name now stood on some of the most recognizable streets on the planet: Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, the Champs-Élysées in Paris, the center of Tokyo. This was no longer simply a British success story. It was briefly one of the defining names in music retail worldwide. One April afternoon in 1997 captured exactly what that scale meant in practice. The Spice Girls, at the absolute height of Spice Mania, chose the Virgin Megastore on Oxford Street to launch their first book, Girl Power. The initial print run of 200,000 copies sold out within a single day. It was the kind of moment that could only happen inside a shop built to hold an entire cultural event under one roof. Fans queuing for hours, a media scrum outside, and a best-selling book gone from the shelves before closing time. Weeks later, the same group would draw 500,000 people to switch on the Christmas lights barely a few hundred yards down the same street. The Megastore sat at the center of that gravity, the natural venue whenever British pop culture needed somewhere to stage itself. Moments like these were not the exception. Across its Oxford Street lifetime, the store hosted in-store performances and signings from acts spanning entire genres. From orchestral maneuvers in the dark to Skid Row to Mythique, turning an ordinary Tuesday afternoon into the kind of thing fans would talk about for years afterwards. For an employee working the shop floor during these years, this was as close to the center of the music industry as a retail job could possibly place you. You might be restocking a shelf one moment and helping usher a queue toward a signing table the next, watching people who'd queued since dawn finally get their 5 seconds with someone they idolized. That sense of occasion traveled down through families in a way few shops ever manage. Parents who'd bought their own first albums at the Oxford Street Megastore in the 1980s were, by the following decade, bringing their own children through the same doors to buy theirs, handing down not just a shopping habit but something closer to a rite of passage. A first Walkman, a first CD, chosen entirely on impulse after an hour spent wandering the aisles. For 2 generations in a row, this was where that moment happened. Geographically, the brand had become something genuinely unifying. A teenager buying a record on Sunset Strip and a teenager buying the same record on Oxford Street were, in a very real sense, having the same experience inside 2 versions of the same idea. The multi-floor browsing culture Branson had first sketched out in a beanbag-strewn shop on Notting Hill Gate, now replicated across continents. Few brands of any kind, let alone a record shop, could claim to have exported a single, coherent experience this faithfully around the globe. It is worth pausing here because it would be easy to rush past this chapter toward the collapse that followed. But the story only makes sense if the peak is felt in full. This was not a company limping along on nostalgia alone. This was, by any measure available at the time, one of the most successful and culturally central retail brands in the world, as embedded in the fabric of British and international youth culture as any high street name has ever been. And yet, somewhere behind the queues and the in-store performances and the record-breaking book launches, the industry that Virgin Megastore had been built to serve was already beginning, almost imperceptibly, to change beneath its feet. The first crack in the Virgin Megastore story didn't appear on Oxford Street, and it didn't look like a threat at all. It appeared on university campuses and home computers in the shape of a small file-sharing program called Napster, launched in 1999. To the average shopper browsing the chart racks that year, nothing about their local megastore had changed. The queues were still there. The listening booths still hummed. But a quiet parallel habit was forming in bedrooms across Britain and America. Teenagers discovering they no longer needed to visit a shop, wait for a release date, or pay full price to hear a new song. They could simply download it. For a format built entirely around the physical browsing experience, floor after floor of CDs, vinyl, and cassettes, designed to be touched, previewed, and carried home. This was not a small shift in customer habits. It was a direct challenge to the reason the megastore existed at all. And because the change happened gradually, one household at a time, almost nobody working the shop floor could point to a single moment and say, "This is when it started going wrong." It simply began showing up, slowly, in numbers that took years to become impossible to ignore. There was a second, quieter pressure building alongside it, and this one was entirely of Virgin's own making. The megastore format had never been cheap to run. Every flagship had been deliberately placed on some of the most expensive retail real estate on the planet. Oxford Street, Sunset Strip, the Champs-Élysées, because visibility and prestige had always been part of the pitch. That strategy made perfect sense when footfall was climbing every year and shoppers were filling baskets with CDs at £15 apiece. It made considerably less sense once the core product people came to buy was quietly losing its reason to exist. A shop this size on rent this high needed enormous volumes of physical sales simply to break even. As those volumes began to soften, the economics that had once seemed unshakable started to look considerably more fragile. The 1998 absorption of our price added its own layer of strain beneath the surface. Bringing 229 additional shops under one roof had briefly made Virgin's UK retail footprint look larger and stronger than ever. But folding 2 different store cultures and stock systems into a single operation was never going to be simple, and the integration diluted some of the very identity that had made the original megastore concept feel special in the first place. What had once been a single, unmistakable flagship experience was now stretched across hundreds of outlets of varying size and character, some of which bore only a passing resemblance to the Oxford Street original. None of this stopped people from coming through the doors. If anything, the shop floor in the early 2000s could feel busier than ever. People still liked to browse, still liked the listening booths, still enjoyed treating a trip to the megastore as an afternoon out. But longtime staff began to notice something subtle in that busyness. More browsing, less buying. Customers would spend an hour testing an album in a listening booth, nodding along, clearly enjoying themselves, and then leave without a purchase. The record they had just previewed already sitting, unpaid for, on a shared computer somewhere by that evening. The shop had, without anyone designing it this way, become an extremely expensive showroom for a product people increasingly acquired for free elsewhere. Inside Virgin's head office, the response to all of this was neither denial nor panic, but something closer to a slow, uneasy repositioning. Branson himself would later describe the shift plainly. Online sales and cut-price supermarket CDs had turned music retailing into a fundamentally different business from the one he'd built 30 years earlier. Rather than fight the format's rising costs directly, Virgin Group began quietly considering a different question. Not how to save the megastore as it stood, but whether retailing itself still belonged inside a company that was rapidly expanding into airlines, mobile networks, and financial services. The megastore was no longer obviously central to what Virgin was becoming. To a shopper walking the aisles in, say, 2003, none of this would have been visible. The shelves were full, the listening booths were busy, the Christmas rush still filled the tills every December. But the foundations underneath the format, cheap physical media, expensive flagship real estate, and a captive audience with no easy alternative, were all quietly eroding at once, and the company's own attention was already beginning to drift elsewhere. How long could a shop this loved keep drawing crowds once the product itself no longer needed a shop at all? Nobody standing on Oxford Street in those years was asking that question out loud. But somewhere in Virgin's boardroom, it was already being asked. And the answer that emerged would set in motion the decisions that finally brought the megastore down. On the 17th of September 2007, Virgin Group announced that its UK and Ireland retail arm, the megastores, the former Our Price shops, the whole domestic network built up over almost 3 decades, was being sold off. A management buyout offer had been accepted. The stores would keep trading, but they would no longer carry the Virgin name. Within weeks, the shop fronts that had defined Oxford Street since 1979 were being rebranded as something else entirely: Zavvi. For Branson, the reasoning was almost clinical. He had said as much himself a decade earlier when Virgin first sold off its American operations. The arrival of online sales and supermarket CD pricing had turned music retailing into a different business from the one he had built at 20. By 2007, with digital downloads no longer a niche curiosity, but the way an entire generation now acquired music, Virgin Group made a strategic choice to step back from retail altogether and concentrate instead on licensing the Virgin name across airlines, mobile networks, and financial services. Businesses less exposed to the collapse of physical media. Selling the stores to the people who already ran them, rather than to an unknown buyer, was framed as the responsible way to let go. What almost nobody outside the boardroom fully appreciated at the time was just how exposed the new company would be. Zavvi's entire stock supply ran through a single, decisive channel. Entertainment UK, the wholesale distribution arm of Woolworths, one of Britain's oldest and most familiar retail names. It was a sensible-looking arrangement on paper. An established supplier with deep buying relationships across the music and film industry, feeding stock into over 100 Zavvi shops nationwide. Nobody involved in structuring the deal in 2007 could have known that within little more than a year, Woolworths itself would be fighting for its own survival, and that Zavvi's fate had been quietly tied to it. For the staff who transferred across from Virgin to Zavvi that autumn, the change felt at first almost cosmetic. The shelves looked the same. The listening culture, the in-store events, the after-school and Saturday crowds, all of it carried on largely as before, just under a different name stitched above the door. Few people working the tills in late 2007 had any reason to think they were now standing inside a considerably more fragile business than the one they joined. Across the Atlantic, the same year produced a very different kind of reckoning, one with none of Zavvi's ambiguity about intentions. Virgin's American retail arm had never quite matched the scale of its British operation, peaking at 23 megastores that together generated around $310 million a year at their height. But by 2007, Virgin Group sold the U.S. business to two real estate firms, Related Companies and Vornado Realty Trust. The stated purpose of the purchase was not to keep the stores running. It was to close them, and in doing so, to unwind the long-term commercial leases the megastores held on some of the most valuable retail addresses in American cities, from Times Square to Sunset Strip, freeing that real estate for other tenants willing to pay considerably more than a struggling record shop. This was not a rescue. It was an acquisition built entirely around the value of the ground the store stood on, not the business operating on top of it. 11 U.S. locations were closed gradually through 2007 under the new ownership, each closure a small, quiet confirmation of what the deal had always been for. Employees at surviving stores were, in effect, working out the final months of leases their new landlords had bought specifically in order to end. For the people on the shop floor, the disconnect was stark. Many had built careers inside the megastore culture, the same culture of listening booths and in-store performances that had made the brand feel irreplaceable to its customers for 2 decades. Now they were reporting to owners whose primary interest was the square footage beneath their feet, not the community that had gathered on it. There was no dramatic announcement, no single day when the truth became obvious. It surfaced the way most quiet corporate decisions do, through a slow trickle of confirmed closures, one flagship at a time, until the pattern became impossible to miss. On both sides of the Atlantic, in different ways, the same underlying truth was taking shape by the end of 2007. In Britain, ownership had passed to people who genuinely wanted to keep the shops running, but had bet the entire operation on a supply chain that was, unknown to them, already standing on unstable ground. In America, ownership had passed to people who had no intention of keeping the shops running at all. Neither story involved recklessness on the shop floor or any failure by the staff who kept the tills open and the listening booth humming right up until the end. The decisions that sealed the megastore's fate had been made far above them, in boardrooms neither Oxford Street shoppers nor Sunset Strip regulars would ever see. And by the time those decisions became visible to the public, there would be almost no time left to reverse course. The first sign that Xavi was in real trouble came not from the shop floor, but from a name that, on its own, meant nothing to most music fans: Woolworths. Through the autumn of 2008, as the global financial crisis tightened credit across the entire retail sector, Woolworths Group began sliding toward collapse. Few Xavi customers had any reason to connect the two companies, but Woolworths owned Entertainment UK, the wholesale distributor that supplied almost all of Xavi's stock. Every CD, every DVD, every new release that filled the shelves inherited from Virgin the year before. When Woolworths went into administration in late November 2008, Entertainment UK went down with it. And when Entertainment UK stopped delivering stock, Xavi's shelves had nowhere left to draw from. There was no cushion, no backup supplier waiting in reserve. On the 24th of December 2008, Christmas Eve, the single busiest trading day of the retail calendar, Xavi entered administration. For staff who had spent the day ringing up last-minute gifts, the news landed with a particularly cruel timing. The shop they'd been standing in that same afternoon no longer had a functioning company behind it. What followed was not a single dramatic closure, but a slow, visible unraveling that played out over the following weeks in full view of the public. Shelves that would normally have been restocked for the January sales instead grew steadily emptier. Signs appeared in windows advertising closing down discounts, growing more aggressive by the week. 20% off, then 40%, then everything must go. Regular customers walking past the Oxford Street flagship, the same building that had opened in 1979 promising an endless supply of new music, watched it hollow out in real time. The listening booths standing silent, unplugged, no longer worth the electricity. By February 2009, the process was complete. Every Xavi store in the country had closed. A handful of locations were bought up by rival chain HMV, which absorbed some of the stock and, in places, the staff. Others were taken over by smaller operators. Many simply went dark, their shop fronts empty for months afterwards on high streets that had, until very recently, assumed a music shop of some description would always be there. For employees who had transferred from Virgin to Xavi only 15 months earlier, The emotional arc of that period was difficult to overstate. They had watched their shop change its name once already, told each time that the underlying business was sound. Now they were watching it close for good, not because shoppers had stopped coming. The flagship stores had remained busy right up until the stock ran out, but because a distributor 2 steps removed from their own till had collapsed first. It was, for many of them, a strikingly unfair way for a beloved workplace to end. Undone not by falling demand on the shop floor, but by a financial failure entirely outside their control. 3,000 miles away, the American chapter of the story reached its own ending within weeks of the British one, though the path there had been laid out deliberately 2 years earlier. Since being sold to related companies and Vornado Realty Trust in 2007, the U.S. megastores had been closing gradually, one lease at a time, exactly as their new owners had always intended. There was no single crisis behind these closures, no distributor collapsing, no supply chain breaking down. There was simply a countdown that had started the day the sale was signed. On the 2nd of March 2009, Virgin Group confirmed what had effectively been inevitable since 2007. Every remaining Virgin Megastore in the United States would close. The Sunset Strip flagship, the very first American store, opened in 1992 in a location chosen specifically for its symbolic weight in music history, shut its doors along with the rest. For American staff, the closure carried a different flavor of grief than their British counterparts felt. There was no sudden Christmas Eve shock, no supplier collapsing without warning. Instead, there had been 2 slow years of watching sister stores close one by one, of understanding, increasingly clearly, that their own branch's turn was simply a matter of time. When the final closures were confirmed, it read less like breaking news and more like the final page of a story everyone in the building had already read the ending of. Customers on both sides of the Atlantic experienced their own version of the same farewell. In London, longtime shoppers described walking through the Oxford Street store in its final days and barely recognizing it. Shelves half empty, discount signs taped over what had once been carefully curated listening displays, staff working with a kind of weary politeness that came from knowing there was no longer a company left to be loyal to. In Los Angeles, the Sunset Strip closure drew its own quiet mourning from a music scene that had watched the store host decades of releases and appearances. For some, the closing sales felt less like a bargain and more like picking through the remains of something that had mattered. The press in both countries told the story in strikingly similar terms, not merely as the failure of one company, but as a symbol of something larger ending. British papers framed the Xavi collapse as a casualty of the same credit crunch, claiming banks and car manufacturers that winter, proof that even beloved high street names were not immune. American coverage folded the megastore closures into a broader narrative about the decline of the physical record store altogether. One more name added to a list that, within a few years, would include Tower Records, Sam Goody, and dozens of smaller independents. Few outlets on either side of the ocean treated it as an isolated business failure. Almost all of them treated it as an ending, the last chapter of a particular way of buying and discovering music that was simply not coming back. By the spring of 2009, the Virgin Megastore name had effectively vanished from 2 of its largest and most symbolically important markets within a span of 10 weeks. The Oxford Street flagship that had opened in 1979, promising something the size and ambition British music retail had never seen before, and the Sunset Strip store, built specifically to plant that same idea on American soil, had both gone dark. What remained of the brand survived only in smaller, licensed form in the Middle East and North Africa, a fraction of what had once stretched at its height across 6 continents. Something real had been lost, and it had been lost quickly. The listening booths were gone. The in-store performances were gone. An entire generation's ritual of losing an afternoon inside a shop built for exactly that purpose was, for most of the Western world, simply over. In the years immediately following the closures, the physical spaces the megastore left behind told their own story about what had actually won. In Britain, HMV absorbed some of the strongest Xavi locations and a portion of its staff, extending physical music retail's life by a few more years before facing its own well-documented troubles further down the line. But the real beneficiaries were never other shops at all. They were the platforms that had quietly been dismantling the Megastore's business model for a decade beforehand. iTunes and soon after, streaming services like Spotify, which offered exactly what Napster had first hinted at in 1999. Music without the shop, without the queue, without the need to leave the house at all. The Oxford Street flagship itself, the building that had opened in 1979, promising something British retail had never seen before, eventually became a branch of Primark. A changeover that, more than almost any other detail, marked how completely the ground beneath music retail had shifted. The Virgin Megastore name did not disappear entirely. Under license, it survived and, in places, quietly grew across the Middle East and North Africa, where the brand continued opening stores well into the 2010s and beyond, eventually reinventing itself as a broader lifestyle retailer, selling fashion, tech, and gifts alongside music and film. It was, in its own way, a kind of revival, proof that the name still carried enough goodwill to build a business around. But it bore little resemblance to the format that had defined Oxford Street and Sunset Strip. The six-floor flagship built for aimless Saturday browsing, the listening booths, the in-store performances that turned a Tuesday afternoon into a piece of pop history, none of that carried over. What survived was the brand. What was lost was the experience. The broader lesson for the retail and music industries arrived with unusual clarity because two very different collapses had landed within weeks of each other and pointed to the same underlying truth. A shop built entirely around a physical product cannot survive the disappearance of that product, no matter how beloved the shop itself remains. It did not matter that customers still queued for in-store events, still enjoyed the listening booths, still treated a trip to the Megastore as an afternoon out in itself. The affection people felt for the shop had never been in question. What had changed was simpler and more brutal than any question of loyalty. The thing being sold no longer needed a shop to be sold from. For the towns and city centers that had built parts of their identity around these flagships, the loss went beyond one company's balance sheet. Oxford Street lost a landmark that had drawn people to that stretch of pavement for 3 decades. One of the anchors that gave the street its particular character beyond simply being a place to shop. High streets across Britain and America alike lost the shared, semi-public spaces where strangers had once stood side by side in listening booths, discovering the same record at the same moment. A form of communal discovery that algorithms, impersonal playlists, for all their convenience, have never quite managed to replace. What, then, does it mean to lose a place like that and have nothing quite take its shape again? The record shop did not vanish because people stopped loving music or stopped wanting somewhere to share that love with strangers. It vanished because the machinery built to deliver that experience, the flagship lease, the physical stock, the queue at the listening booth, belonged to an era of music retail that had simply run its course. The affection remained. The format it had lived inside did not. Picture it one last time. Oxford Street, a Saturday afternoon, sometime in the mid-1990s. The doors of the Megastore stand open onto the pavement, and inside, 6 floors rise up around you, each one humming with its own fragment of sound. Somewhere near the entrance, a listening booth is occupied by a stranger with headphones on, eyes half closed, nodding along to something you can't quite hear. The air smells of fresh plastic sleeves and new carpet. Racks of vinyl and CDs stretch further than seems reasonable for a single shop, and none of it feels like a chore to walk through. There is nowhere you need to be. There is only the next record and the one after that, and the quiet, particular pleasure of not knowing yet what you are about to find. The Virgin Megastore was never really in the business of selling records. It was in the business of giving people somewhere to go and discover them together. That distinction mattered more than it seemed to at the time. A record bought alone, at home, from a screen, is still a record. But something is missing from that transaction that the Megastore, almost by accident, had gotten right from its very first incarnation above a shoe shop on Notting Hill Gate. The beanbags, the free food, the invitation to simply stay a while. It understood, before almost anyone else in British retail did, that music is meant to be discovered in the presence of other people who feel the same pull toward it that you do. Strangers in adjoining listening booths, teenagers queuing overnight for an album launch. A generation of parents handing their own first record shop memory down to their children, one Saturday afternoon at a time. None of that was really about commerce. It was about belonging to something larger than your own record collection, a shared cultural moment built out of shelving and headphones and floor space that no algorithm, however precise, has ever quite managed to reproduce. Nobody set out to destroy the Virgin Megastore, not Branson, who built it from nothing and watched the industry around it change faster than any single company could adapt to. Not the staff in Britain who kept the tills running until the stock simply ran out from under them. Not the employees in America who watched their stores close one lease at a time, long before anyone told them it was happening. The world the megastore was built for changed, as worlds do, and the shop that had once seemed permanent did not survive the change. That is not a failure to be mourned with blame. It is simply a loss to be acknowledged honestly for what it was. Somewhere, a person who once queued on Oxford Street for an album launch will describe that afternoon to someone younger who has never set foot in a record shop at all. The smell of it, the sound of it, the particular thrill of finding something you didn't know you were looking for. The listener may never fully understand what that felt like, but they will understand, from the way it is told, that something real and communal and unmistakably alive once stood on that stretch of pavement. And for a little while, it was worth every bit of the crowd it drew.